Hi everyone, good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you. Damn it, if her grandmother had heard such a foul expression from her pupil's lips, she would have deprived her of sweets for a week and made her wash her mouth out with soap and water. But as the grandmother was fast asleep at the late midnight hour, Juliana remained unpunished. At last, having stopped pacing her room like a caged animal in a zoo, the young girl plumped down on the bed, which squeaked pitifully with the shell netting, raked the teddy bear into a pile, and burying herself in its worn chocolate-colored fur, silently wept. How? Well, how could she be such a fool? Fall so low? However, Juliana's brain obligingly told her there was still time before the immediate fall. 21 hours and 30 minutes. The exact time was told to her by the dial of the alarm clock, on which she cast a tear-fogged glance. It was in that time frame that she was to report to the hideous, impossible, heartless wretch in order to... It all happened 10 days ago. Julianne was in the school library, where she had just returned the book she had read and had volunteered to help the old librarian, who was suffering from sciatica from the rainy weather and was shoving them herself. "You can't reach it, little one," came a mocking voice over her shoulder, and the schoolgirl shrieked and turned around abruptly. Scared her, because of the height difference, she jammed her nose into the voice owner's chest at armpit level. "No," she answered sharply, and gritting her teeth, she looked up, glaring boldly and contemptuously. Alfred, the terror of the whole school, a bully and just the embodiment of all male vices. The distance between the shelves left no room for maneuvering, but Julianne still twisted, turned, sliding her side involuntarily on his thigh, and stood on tiptoe, reached up a little more, and the book about the lives of the greatest ancient Greek philosophers would be in place. She decided that she would just ignore Alfred. Shit on him. Not this pleasure. Grandmother, by the way, even in her mind forbade swearing. But her granddaughter allowed herself to do it in her mind. Because life was such that sometimes got through on emotions and nothing could not be done about it. Julianne repeated to herself that she didn't care, that he continued to stand behind her, probably squinting mockingly at her blue eyes, so piercing that he seemed to see right through you. There was a rustling sound as Alfred scratched the blonde back of his head. What an unseemly habit! And then he suddenly snatched the book from her, yanked it out of her hand, and slid it back onto the shelf himself. "I didn't ask." She choked on air before she could finish, because he immediately grabbed her shoulders and turned her around to face him, literally slamming her back into the shelving unit. "We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you." Julianne raised her voice, and then, remembering where she was, switched to a whisper. "I don't want to talk to you." "Is that so? After all you've done?" He lowered his tone too, as if to tease me. "By the way, you've caused me so much damage." He called everyone up to the director. "Losses? Who would even think of trading test answers?" "Businessman," hummed Alfred. "You're a dishonest man. You're a liar. You tell me you're not a gentleman." His hand suddenly moved from the girl's rounded shoulder to her thin, tall neck. Her fingers ran along the edge of the white starched collar of her uniform dress, as if groping, outlining the contour of her collarbones. "What is it about you, huh? You dress like a grandmother and act like one." "What are you doing?" the girl whispered. Her voice was quiet, barely audible, no longer out of habit of following the library rules, but because of the strange numbness spreading through her body from where Alfred touched. "Yes, so," he grinned, but with just his lips. His eyes were cold. There was nothing to do. He pulled away, took a step to the side, and so some distance finally appeared between them. The obsession was over. Nothing to do. Julianne gasped for air. Alfred stood with his hands in the pockets of his jeans. On top of a T-shirt with some soccer club symbols and a black jacket, obviously a size or two larger than necessary. Despite his tall height of almost 190 centimeters, the guy was not very broad in the shoulders and was terribly complex about it, but kept it, of course, in secret. Alfred was the storm of the school, elusive, and at the same time, a well-known bully for the whole neighborhood. Well, for his half of it, exactly. And he was also a repeater with a long history of delay in the 3rd, 6th, and 8th grades. It was hard to understand what was the terrible truth about him and what was a terrible rumor. But in any case, it would be hard to find a person more opposite in terms of qualities and features noticeable at first sight, compared to Juliana. She, like him, turned 18 this spring, at the very beginning of the season, when the first drop appeared from the roofs. But if Alfred looked 20, Juliana, much younger than her age. The principal, the canteen girl, and some other people admired it, loved to compare how different the schoolgirl looked from her peers. That was different, and in general lived right. Took care of Juliana Leslie's grandmother, who for 10 years has also been her guardian after the death of her parents, who died in a car accident, and the only one of her kindred person in the world. 2 people who belonged to very different eras, lived in a 3-room apartment. Stalinka. In her working past, Leslie taught history and literature. Almost 30 years lived in the far north. Her pension was decent. She had enough to live on. However, an outside observer might decide that the life of grandmother and her granddaughter was peculiar. Juliana received an exceptionally strict domestic upbringing. Grandmother had no doubt that the modern world could not be trusted with a child. Grind young, stupid creature, destroy the soul, morality, cripple the future. Leslie herself kept herself apart, socialized only with a few worthy, in her opinion, people about her age. And if there was anyone who had the audacity to say that she was treating the child somehow wrong, that person received such an angry, logically structured and reasoned response that he himself was guilty of everything, and in general, shame, shame, shame on his head. And in time the neighbors got used to it. After all, every family has its own rules. Everyone knows that. And since Leslie's pupil was cleanly dressed and frozen in winter, was always well fed, well behaved, since Leslie herself had an impeccable reputation for the last 50 years. Then in time, everyone calmed down, and even began to envy a little. After all, Leslie brought up her granddaughter so that just a gold, not a girl, not at all like modern children, the joy of the family, just a little good, not a girl. Until the 5th grade, Juliana was home, schooled, and then still went to school, and she was the black sheep. Her teachers praised her for her diligence and intelligence. They gave her once only got a K for an essay on how I spent my summer. In it, a 6th grader described how she had spent the whole summer reading works on world economy and the history of capitalism. The teacher said that it was very informative, but I would like to know about her personal, so to speak, life impressions. Adventures? Was it really just books all summer? Juliana answered boldly that her grandmother had a friend, Alexander Schwartz, who was 90 years old on his birthday and had written books on the history of capitalism. That's why it was necessary to read them all, and then, according to the results, so to speak, write a poem and read it to the Jubilee. Everything else is selfishness and vanity against the background of such an important matter. If Juliana had said this one, on one, the teacher might not have gotten angry, but the confrontation happened in front of the whole class. The class fell down from laughter, and the teacher gave her a C. Because of the C, the girl became ill. Such a hysteria happened, which ended with fainting, that an ambulance had to be called. Naturally, the teacher replaced the CEEAB. For goodness sake. But Juliana still long walked in sadness and told everyone that she was a talentless and a failure, since her essay was evaluated only on some pathetic 3. However, Juliana stood out not only the specifics of his study. She dressed very original. The closet of the pupil, of course, was occupied by her grandmother and consisted of things good, new, but only sewed on the fashion of the 30s of the last century, and that they were not the most fashionable, dressy styles of that era. The shoes were also the most modest, flat shoes, not stained. Her classmates were growing up, becoming teenagers, young girls. They were learning to use makeup, getting manicures, coloring their hair. Julianne couldn't afford any of that. Not that she didn't want to. Sometimes she thought her grandmother was too strict, but then she remembered that Leslie had a weak heart, and that in the modern world life was not so easy because of such loose morals, and any rudiments of rebellious sentiments withered like wheat without water in the hot summer. However, Juliana was not one of those bad girls who can be transformed only by a beauty salon. By adulthood, the girl's figure had become feminine, soft and lush, in the right places, outlines. She had a slightly elongated face with high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a wide, sensual mouth. Gray eyes were framed by black, fluffy lashes. Her long brown hair was never seen in anything but one of 3 hairstyles: 2 braids on each side, 1 braid in the back, or 1 braid in the back, or 1 braid arranged in a wreath around her head. Add to this refined manners, shyness, modesty, and the habit of keeping in the shadow of everything bright, noisy, provocative, modern. And also the fact that almost all her interests in daily activities were filtered through her grandmother's opinion on whether it was worthy, whether it was decent. If some meticulous outsider were to analyze Juliana like a strange exotic animal, he would easily find the reasons why people around her perceived her as a strange person, and that was putting it mildly, and only in exceptional cases, such as in clashes with Alfred, who for the last 2 years had increasingly made her the object of his attacks, light but offensively barbed. Only in rare cases Julianne's usual calmness would come off, and she would begin. Not that she would be rude, never, but to answer sharply and defend herself vigorously. "So, you have nothing to do," Julianne repeated. "Well, go and study, you idiot, or help out. Someone broke a window in class 3. It's blowing. There are kids there. You need to..." "Wow, you're quick," Alfred smiled as usual. "No, you're acting like a grandmother, and thinking the same way. You know what? I've sorted out my problems. I won't be expelled, thanks to Maria Ivanovna, our class teacher. She covered for me. She, understands. If you give her a hand..." "What?" "Yes, Maria. She has 4 children. She's a kind-hearted, fair-minded person. You don't believe me. You want to bet. She's gonna give John an A on the test, because his daddy brought her candy and stuff." John was an incorrigible loser, and no one in the class doubted that he would fail the math final. Julianne had heard of bets, or rather she had read about them. In some books, noble people made them, and usually it didn't end well. There was no way she was going to take some stupid bet, but today was not the right day at all. First, the grandmother thought her granddaughter had splashed herself in the morning. The girl swore she never went near her grandmother's dressing table, but she made her go to the bathroom to clean herself up anyway. Then it turned out that the grandmother just thought that in the closet there was a moth, so she put perfume and sprayed there. That's why Julianne's clothes smelled. The grandmother didn't apologize, and Juliana felt unjustly offended. Then before school she ran to the store to get tights. It was not a boutique, but a very modest store of youth clothes, and it was here that she and her grandmother sometimes came when they needed to buy Juliana something that Leslie could not sew. Usually it was something from outerwear. This time one of the salesgirls did not just watch from a distance as usual, but approached Juliana. The girl thought that she probably did that because she didn't have her grandmother with her now, or she wouldn't have dared to approach. Her grandmother couldn't stand all those consultants and knew how to chase them away. The saleswoman started talking about new youth clothes, very stylish denim skirts and beautiful sweaters. Julianne glanced at this and turned away. No. Even if she herself had been wearing what her grandmother sewed for 2 years now, there was no way she was going to upset her and dress differently. "I feel sorry for the girl," sighed behind her back, sharing with a colleague. "What a wild thing to say. How will she, poor thing, live when Grandma is gone? Will be lost with such an attitude. She's not adapted to life at all. No. She'll be left without an apartment or lured into a cult. And where do the neighbors and teachers look, eh?" It was hard, painful to hear that. And at the same time, Juliana couldn't help but admit that this woman, Caroline saw the name on the counselor's name tag. She was right about something. Juliana was really scared to think about the time when she would be alone. Grandma had been talking a lot lately about her grandfather taking her to heaven soon. And she, Juliana, if she misbehaved, she would end her days on the pavement. So, to prevent that from happening, she would have to study hard, protect herself, and be a man of honor. "What's the bet?" Julianne blurted out before she could even think about what she was doing. "That's a different conversation." Alfred's voice had a purr in it. "If you're right and John fails, I'll pay back the money I won from Toby." Julianne nodded. "That would be very good." That would be great, because Toby was a third grader from a large family, and he'd lost everything he'd saved from his pocket money for 6 months. "And I'll also sign up for these." What's their name? Volunteers. "And I'm going to go to the city park and plant trees, and I'm not going to swear. Okay?" "Yes, I agree." "Wait," he suddenly grabbed her wrist. "You didn't even ask what you'd owe if you lost. What do you want?" She opened her eyes. Her wrist burned. It wasn't the pain of the grip that was barely perceptible. It was some other strange perception of his closeness. "You agreed to the bet, right?" "But I did. You know, I don't follow you much. It's too much. But I remember you were talking in literature class about keeping your word. Something about honor. Was there?" "It was." The girl exhaled and tensed, preparing to wrench her arm free. "Which means you'll keep your word. And if you lose, you come where I tell you to come." "Why?" Julianne squeaked. Theoretically, the guy was very clear. Only in the brain as an automatic system went off from the logical deciphering of this phrase to spend the night. "Why should we come to your place for the night?" "Well, don't play dumb. You understand everything," he said simply. And then he let her go, winked, and disappeared as if he'd vanished among the shelves. Julianne stood there, barely breathing, staring blankly at herself. Oh no, what was going to happen to her now? How could she? How dare he? The girl swallowed hard. Had Alfred not had enough of the atrocities he was doing? Why would he do this to her? Why would he do this to her? Why? There you are. The librarian appeared in the aisle. After she had instructed the polite girl to arrange the books, she took time out to have some tea. Oh, why are you so pale? Did you put all the books away? What's new on your list? Yes, that's it, Julianne replied, her thoughts wandering far away from the library. Thank you, there's nothing. And she left. Much to the amazement of the old librarian, she didn't even say goodbye. And then the day of the test came. John was sitting next to Julianne, and she realized, peeking carefully, that he had no solutions to the problems, but a lot of nonsense. Finally, everyone handed in their notebooks. Julianne cast a triumphant glance at Alfred, who was sitting on the Kamchatka. She had no doubt that everything would be as it should be, that justice would prevail, that he would lose, that he would be shamed, and that he would be forced to take the path of correction. He might have promised everything just to annoy her, but in the end it would all have a positive effect on him, of course. And then It became known that John had gotten a 5. Alfred found her, or rather caught her, just outside the school gates, just growing in front of her so that she crashed into him again. "Hi!" "Hi," the girl replied and lowered her head. "Well, well, well. Why are we so sad? Does it feel bad to lose? But it had to happen sometime. You can't live your whole life so right, so perfect. You're judging me." I tried to go around, but he wouldn't let me. "Okay, let's not get into any of your ideas, okay? We had a bet. Now you have to do what we agreed to do. You know, this is kind of fun. If it were anyone else, I'm sure the other girl would have sent the bet and me far away. But you're not like that, are you? You gave your word. So, here you go." He held out some paper. "My father had a summer house in the suburbs. There's no one there now. Come Saturday night. Hey, you're not going to cry, are you? Don't worry, I won't bite. We'll have a great time. I'll treat you to kebabs." Julianne opened her mouth to say that she couldn't come anywhere. Because how could she possibly explain her grandmother's absence at night? She didn't even have any friends she could, theoretically, stay overnight. But she didn't say anything. Alfred left the school with a double feeling. On the one hand, he had managed to achieve something that seemed unreal, but on the other hand, he felt as if he had soiled himself in something nasty, dirty. Juliana was different from the other girls, and for more than a year she had been only an object of interested, mocking observation. But then he began to notice things that others didn't. How good she was. Always a straight back, proud, but not haughty, but a sort of, here, the right word for it is aristocratic head planting. This girl never gossiped about others, never brought cheat sheets. It was clear she didn't live an easy life, but no one heard her complain. It seemed that she existed in her own closed, like a soap bubble, world. At recess, she would duck into a book and go deaf. Then one day, she suddenly noticed Alfred was in a bad mood and threw something like, "Don't take offense. She wouldn't understand." This phrase referred to the conversation Alfred had had with his geography teacher for about 10 minutes, who had reprimanded him harshly and with a switch to personalities for not having done his homework, and didn't want to hear about the fact that there was no time for it, because Alfred's apartment was being renovated and he couldn't refuse to help. She always scolded her students harshly for everything after her husband got his paycheck, because, as rumor had it, the lion's share of that salary he took to his mistress. So she found someone to take her anger out on. It was Julianne's statement that caught Alfred's eye. He didn't ask for pity, and no one dared tell him what to think or feel. He tried to hurt Julianne with taunts, but it was all in vain. He began to observe her more, and he didn't realize how it turned into an obsession. Yes, that word seemed quite right to him, and Alfred didn't want to do anything about it. Why should he? After all, she, in all likelihood, like many other people, already had a certain idea of him, so why disappoint her? And even if he had no chance of gaining her favor in kind, well, so be it. But he would get what he wanted. Julianne was greeted by the familiar, adoring smells of her grandmother's late lunch of chicken noodle soup and blueberry puff pastries. But before she sat down at the table, at the very threshold, Grandmother asked Juliana what grade her test had gotten at school. Only when she was satisfied with the answer did she tell her to take off her shoes and wash her hands. Then they sat down to watch TV, and some old movie about the Musketeers was on. Then Grandma, though it was already 8 o'clock in the evening, took out the crystal from the cupboard, though she hadn't had time to wash it in the morning, so she had to wash it in the evening, she said, handing her pupil an apron, without which no housework could be done. Then Leslie went to bed. Julianne was left to herself. The hands on the dial were approaching midnight, inexorably approaching the coming of Saturday. The girl convulsively sucked in air. Leaned back on the bed, closed her eyes. What should she do? Break her word? She could, of course. It was unlikely that for such dishonorable behavior she would be immediately hit by karma, a boomerang. That is, a deserved retribution from fate, which her grandmother was so fond of talking about. And anyway, Julianne somehow couldn't imagine how she would exist after, not to mention that this very thing, the very thing she had signed up for. Julianne sat up abruptly on the bed, then paced the room. Then a "damn it" came from her lips. Julianne was more and more inclined to tell her grandmother, and let her scold, let her punish. But then she would have the opportunity to think of two minds how to be now. Grandmother would not leave her, would comfort her and say that, of course, there could be only a negative answer. "Granddaughter," came the voice of an old woman in the hallway. The girl shuddered. "Why isn't Granny asleep?" "She can't read minds, I think." "Granddaughter," Leslie repeated in a hoarse, weak voice. "I have a heart attack. Call an ambulance." The doctor said it looked like a heart attack was imminent, and hospitalization was necessary. Julianne fumbled around, gathering the things she would need at the hospital, according to her grandmother's instructions. Leslie was taken away. Julianne returned to the apartment, locked the front door, sank down on the banquette in the hallway, and covered her face with her hands and sobbed. What a nightmare. Everything was turning out to be just a black streak, and at the same time, it was impossible not to recognize that this misfortune allows her to carry out her plans, because her grandmother will be in the hospital for a few days, and therefore the fact that her granddaughter did not spend the night at home will not become known to her. Frivolous books, erotic movies, such in the cultural and educational menu compiled by her grandmother for Juliana was not. Naturally, the young girl had some knowledge about the relationship between the sexes, and the school program introduced to the fact that children are not found in cabbage. And yet, the girl understood that if she thought about what she was going to do a little more, she would simply lose her feelings. Theoretically, in this, of course, there was a plus: the date would be canceled. But the downside was, she would essentially be betraying her habit of being an honest person. "Today you lied about finishing the cutlets and threw them away." Her grandmother had once reprimanded her, and for some reason that incident was particularly sharp in Juliana's memory. And tomorrow her grandmother narrowed her eyebrows and slapped the missing cutlets in front of her. "You'll go stealing, or run over a man with a car at a green light." "Grandma, please forgive me," little Julianne asked, choking back tears. "You're not going to make me finish them, are you?" They were in the garbage pail. Leslie stroked the girl's head and then grabbed her ear, pulling her away from the table. "Take them out and give them to the stray cats that live in the basement. Stick your hands straight up and throw them down." "Grandma," the girl even stopped crying out of fear. "We don't have cats under the house, only rats." "There are rats there. I don't want to." "It's too late, sweetheart," the old woman grinned. "You have to take responsibility for your actions. Go. And if the rats bite your fingers," she touched each of the 5 fingers on her granddaughter's left hand, "it'll be your own fault. I, my dear, ready to love you in every way. Even if you were crooked on your face, even if you studied for D's. But if I find out that you're lying, if I find out that you don't keep your word, if you ever lie to me like this again, you'll drive me into a coffin with this, and you won't have a grandmother anymore. You'll go to an orphanage to live. Do you understand?" After that, 10-year-old Juliana realized that she would always all her life, be an honest person, and she would not break her word to go and give herself into the hands of the monster in human form. Juliana chose her weekend dress, the most elegant dress, snow-white Richelieu fabric, sun skirt and wing-sleeved. Her hair was bound with a dark green ribbon. She decided not to think about what would happen until it happened. She decided to take it one step at a time, gather herself and make sure all appliances were turned off, leave the apartment and the house. At the bus stop, take a bus to the station where the commuter trains leave from. Get off the light version of the train, and she was a little confused, but she was told the way was to walk across a field. It was not terrible. There were more people walking there. Some cheerful company of grannies, gardeners. They were singing songs. A young, strong voice suddenly broke into their elderly chorus. The grandmothers marveled at the unusual companion who, so young, knew the words of the old hymn, but immediately sang again, and so the whole company reached the dacha community. It was separated from a small village with a funny name of Jaziki by a field where in the old days huge herds of cows grazed, and now rare livestock kept by the locals. A little farther south, the village and the dacha estates were surrounded by a river that dried up to the bottom during the hot summer months. "Who are you here to see, honey?" one of the old ladies asked. "Just here." Julianne frowned. "Some acquaintance has asked me to drop something off." She waved her hand in the direction, toward the woods, not the houses. "Well, good luck to you," replied the old woman, realizing that the girl did not want to talk about herself. All right. Alfred's cottage was really near the forest and stood at the very edge of the community, and it looked abandoned. Julianne shuddered at his choice of a place for a date. She knew he didn't live alone and was being raised by a distant relative after Alfred's father had been imprisoned for theft a few years ago. Julianne also knew that the boy's father had passed away last year. She had sympathized with him then and even tried to get close to him, to comfort him. Maybe he had misunderstood her attention then, had made up something for himself. By evening it was noticeably colder, and the girl chose her clothes according to the weather, which was still sunny and warm. But now it didn't seem to matter at all that her body was shivering. What was frightening was something else. Finally, Julianne found herself on the porch and knocked on the door. "Hi," he said, and a look of amazement flashed across his face as if he was sure she wasn't coming. "Hi," she said, thinking that awkward mutual greetings like this were becoming a habit. Julianne didn't want to make any habits with this guy. "Come on in." He stepped aside, letting me into the house. The girl froze, hesitated, as if something nightmarish was waiting for her beyond the threshold. However, in fact, it was so. Inside the house turned out to be as she had expected it to be, in need of repair and general cleaning. The furniture had been brought in on a what-not-to-spare basis, and the floors were painted a luscious orange. Julianne remembered that the same floors had been in her grandmother's house in the country. She had been there only a few times, and then she had sold it because she didn't have the energy to travel to keep everything in order, and it was too far away to use it as a summer house. But the main reason for getting rid of the family nest was that she needed money for her, Juliana, nurturing. This word nurturing grandmother used, by the way, when she wanted to reproach her granddaughter. "They say I spend so much effort raising you, and you still manage to catch a cold in winter, tear a new dress on a walk, refuse to drink fish oil for immunity, do not put away Tui's list." The list of reasons for reproach was endless. And only when Juliana grew up, or rather when she was 15, she began to think that she was not to blame for everything and everything. Just sometimes, Grandma needed a fight, and the person to do it with at will was just her kindergartner. "So, do you want a drink?" Alfred threw awkwardly, escorting the girl deep into the house. "I don't drink," she said, glancing at him warily. No, I already know. I'm asking about the tea." "No." "Coffee?" "No, I'm not after that. And you? We can." She stood close again, and he could almost feel her breath. "Now," Alfred looked dumbfounded. "I know I have a reputation, but why are you attacking me like—" Courtesans used to be called courtesans, didn't they? "Yes. There, you see. Turns out we can speak the same language," he smirked. "Okay, that was an unfortunate comparison. I'm sorry. But do you think I'm going to attack you like a barbarian?" Julianne said nothing. Alfred sighed, sniffled oddly, and stepped back, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jeans. It was quite dusky in this part of the cottage. Light poured in from the ajar door on the right, and there were two in this cluttered hallway, or cluttered living room. Or rather, a cluttered living room, because there couldn't possibly be a living room at the cottage. Julianne was more inclined toward the latter, given the fireplace she'd noticed, which must have been unheated for 100 years, so dusty and littered with debris. But she was much more interested in Alfred than in the surroundings. On the way here, her brain had been drawing the most fantastic, disgusting pictures. She imagined being at the mercy of a cynical, immoral scumbag. But why did it seem that now she was just a boy who wanted to seem tough, like the bad guys in action movies, but was desperately afraid of it? So you're shivering and you'll sneeze tomorrow. Apparently, the prolonged silence in which they were frozen, like two exhibits in an abandoned museum, began to irritate him. Come on, I'll put the tea on. Julianne doomedly stomped off to her. What's all this for? What? Drinking me tea. It makes sense because you're cold. What does it matter if you're going to... What are you doing? Squealed the girl as Alfred pulled the sweater over his head. The guy froze and rounded his eyes. She took a step back. Another. She put her back against the wall and put her purse in front of her in a desperate protective gesture. No, please. I'm not ready. A moment later, a scratchy woolen article of clothing flew into her face. Stupid. Here, it's cold to look at. Alfred, who was left in a t-shirt, turned his back to her and began to work on the gas stove. Put it on. I'm not peeking. The desire for warmth outweighed the embarrassment of using something that was not hers, much less a man's. And Julianne tangled in the sleeves and pulled on the sweater. Thank you, she said quietly, so he wouldn't have heard. You know, I'm really surprised you came. It's just doing something on a word of honor. It's kind of old-fashioned these days. Can't do otherwise, she shrugged, sitting down at the table. What if I bet you something worse, like stealing something? That would never happen, Julianne declared smugly. So what happened is, within the bounds of your morality. A teapot and a couple of cups were placed on the table. All three items had clearly once belonged to an obvious set. That's not what I meant to say, the girl muttered. You cheated, caught me giving my word before I knew what the condition was. When he filled the cup, she wrapped her palms around it, her body desperate for some warmth, though it was terribly hot. All right, I give up. I am a scoundrel and a seducer. But the end justified the means. Smiling, he sat down beside me. Is there nothing for tea? She asked timidly, suddenly realizing that her stomach was protesting against the empty drink. Julianne had somehow missed lunch and dinner as she pondered nervously. I had chips and a candy bar, but I ate them while I was waiting for you. Oh no, I'm lying. Here's half a chocolate bar. He added it to the table. I see. For a while there was silence in the kitchen, where a lone light bulb shone, apart from the sounds of tea drinking. What was that? Julianne was suddenly alert. I didn't hear anything, Alfred said nonchalantly. I heard something. You're imagining things. Is there anyone else in the house? The girl went cold. No. You're lying. I'm not lying. There's no one here. The guy nodded at the doorway. Well, except for him. A puppy came into the room. He was a well-fed colobus, a mix of sheepdog and St. Bernard, and he wiggled his nose and paw funny. The first was out of lively young curiosity. The second because it was wrapped in a bandage. Oh, he's so cute. Julianne jumped down from her chair and was next to the puppy in no time. Grandma's strict upbringing included, among other rules, one that read, "No animals in my house. Don't go near dogs in the street. They will chew you up and give you fleas." The puppy recoiled, but then, attracted by the fact that the stranger was wearing a sweater that smelled of his master, he moved forward. Where did he come from? He followed me to the station on the way here. He must have hurt his paw on the street. I patched it up a little. Are you gonna keep it? I have a right to. Alfred grinned unhappily. As long as he lives at the dacha, of course. When I leave here on weekdays, he'll stay with the neighbors. I've already arranged it. And then I'll take it. I've decided to rent an apartment for myself. I'm looking for options. I can't bring him to the apartments. I can't bring him to the place where I live now. They'll throw him out on the street. Alfred whistled, calling the dog. But the girl didn't let the doggy take a step and picked him up in her arms, returned to the table, pulled out a chair, sat down and settled the puppy on her lap. The dog, she stated, a fact already known to the boy. He's so cute. He reached out to stroke it too, and their fingers met in the thick, silky fur. And the fur must have electrified because a strange, lingering sensation hit them both. Julianne froze, wide-eyed, as she watched the boy's face grow closer. "How beautiful you are," he whispered. The next moment their lips were touching. Julianne had read about the miracle of a first kiss, but she hadn't yet imagined what it would be like for her, much less that it could be so dizzying, like being dropped into the sky with this guy. And while the kiss lasted, she forgot everything about the unhappiness with her grandmother, about the fact that he had forced her to a terrible, immoral fall, about the fact that she was entirely at his mercy. The kiss was interrupted for a trivial reason. They realized that they needed a breath of air, and immediately the magic of the first intimacy disappeared. Juliana's hazy gaze cleared, and now instead of sweet tenderness it read disgust and contempt. And Alfred looked back at her haughtily, mockingly. It was the way a victor looks at a coveted trophy that he had already touched, and now the moment of complete possession was at hand. "I hate it." Julianne's voice trembled. The puppy, as if sensing the people's mood, jumped off her lap. "Master, the place." Master informed him, and the dog jogged off into the hallway. Stupid name. Julianne was willing to say anything to hurt him now. She was still thinking of other, more elegant and stronger expressions. "Didn't ask you," growled the guy, rising from the table. She jumped up from the chair, shrieked, and did what all the wilderness survival instructors advised not to do in any case. Turned her back to the main predator in the house. One moment, and he embraced her, turned her to face him, or rather pressed her to him so that the fragile girl's arms pressed against his chest. The forces were, of course, not equal, and he broke her resistance in an instant. The edge of the table hit the girl's lower back, and she grimaced, which he interpreted in his own way. "I realize a girl like you would never get involved with someone like me. But still, you think I'd pass up a chance to give you a kiss? No way." She was about to tell him what she thought of him and his heartless wager, but she only exhaled convulsively, closed her eyes realizing that she would kiss him again. And then she opened her eyes when she heard the glass shatter somewhere nearby. Alfred heard it too. He let go so sharply that Julianne swayed, and only thanks to the painful grip of her fingers on the table did she not fall. "What?" He cut off the question by pressing a finger to his lips. The girl was pierced with fear. It wasn't even a realization that something wrong was happening, but a pure, deep feeling, what might be called a primal intuition that had been keeping people out of trouble for centuries. "Someone is in the house," Alfred whispered, and turned out the kitchen light. Quiet. Now they could hear together the sound of heavy footsteps in the far room of the one on the other side of the living room and hallway. It seemed to be more than one person. "Damn it," Alfred cursed. And Julianne glanced at him, wondering how, however, they could express themselves so similarly. The occasions, of course, were quite different. "Thieves? Are they thieves?" hissed the girl. "There's nothing to take. And usually in winter they go to the cottages," Alfred answered. And though it was almost dark, only the light of the moon slid sparingly through the window, the girl could have sworn that he had turned pale. "We must go away. We need to call," she said. "Phone is in that room." He gritted his teeth and turned to her. "Is it yours?" Julianne quietly picked up her purse from the table. "Opened the... I forgot it at home." Alfred waved his hand, either to mean okay or what a fool. Go on. Go out and go to the neighbors. Call them. And you? The girl asked. The young men were already at the front of the house, and those who had entered in the middle of the night, judging from the sounds, had gone from what might be called a bedroom, with a narrow bed behind the door, to a covered veranda adjoining it, which also played the part of a huge pantry. All this Alfred assessed briskly, pondering what to do next. The door to the second room had been ajar when Juliana had entered the cottage, and apparently the puppy had gone out and back in. I'll get the master and get out too, the guy replied. No, you can't do that. With an unconscious gesture, she grabbed his arm and pulled. Go on, you fool, he shook her off. Go already, Alfred said, and disappeared into the gloom of the room. Julianne clasped her hands together. He's right. She should run and call for help. Why should she hesitate? After all, she wasn't here by choice, and Alfred wasn't a good man at all. She went to the front door and opened it. Luckily, it didn't creak. It was brighter outside than in the house, and already from the porch, you could see the warm glow of the lights in the houses of neighbors. But at that moment, there was a shriek behind her. Julianne darted backward, and again, as if not realizing what she was doing, she grabbed something heavy, but conveniently placed in her clenched palm from a stack of boxes, apparently prepared for removal from the cottage. Approaching the doorway, Julianne cautiously looked inside, and only by an incredible effort she could not keep from screaming. Alfred was lying on the floor, and a skinny man was leaning over him. His long arms were frantically groping the boy's body like the legs of a giant spider ready to taste its prey. What's up? A second guy spoke up. He was not immediately visible as he stood at the other edge of the room by the exit to the veranda. Nothing, replied the long-armed man hoarsely, and unbending, he coughed violently. I think Lawrence has deceived us. Really. The second type swayed, and Julianne, who continued her observation, thought that both of them were drunk. They must be all here. The kid knows something, that's for sure. Come on, tie him up. Let's have a chat. What are you knitting with? Hold on, I'll look it up. Julianne backed away so that she was hidden by the wall. She had not planned, had not guessed how great her chances were. She had almost ceased to realize herself, and there was only one desire, one decision left. She could not leave Alfred here like this. With these villains, the girl could almost physically feel the threat coming from them. They must have been looking for something. But that was not important. What was important was the moment the long-armed man stepped into the hallway. Living room and a cast, iron-frying pan fell upon him. The blow struck him on the head, and most of the weight of the cast-iron pan fell on his shoulder. The stranger howled, then shrieked and collapsed senseless. Julianne, before the other could react, rushed into the room herself and just threw the frying pan forward at random. Lucky for her, the ones who'd gotten into the house hadn't expected to find anyone other than the boy, the son of their longtime debtor, and so they'd been confused. But the other man managed to dodge. He ducked back into the veranda, startled by the attack. He didn't rush to his friend's aid because he didn't know who else was there. Alfred groaned, moved, and started to rise. Alfred, run. The girl rushed to him and suddenly jerked him upward hard, helping him to stand up. I told you, said the boy, slurring his tongue and grimacing with pain. The blow of the bandit who had attacked earlier had hit his jaw, and judging by the sensations, it was impossible to do without a visit to the dentist. The villain, who was hiding on the veranda, had a flashlight with him. Its beam caught the young men, and they turned around synchronously like young Olechka caught in a forest clearing by the light of headlights. Oh, you, said the man in the distinctive prisoner's clothing, swearing foully and spitting through his teeth. Another girl, where are you? Stop right there. Run! Julianne shrieked. That's it, you're finished. The convict grinned and pulled something from his belt that glinted like steel in the cold light of the moon. They were separated by a mere 3 or 4 meters. He was not a coward, but he was not a fool to stay heroically in the house and engage in hand-to-hand combat. Tief. Tief. A puppy threw itself at his master's feet. He wasn't a coward either, but he was too young. And when the house had been broken into, he'd just been scared and huddled under the couch, crying in his own puppy way. And now the two good people he knew were there, he'd risked getting out. Julianne took an extra couple of seconds to bend down and pick up the baby. How did you? Alfred's eyes widened as they stepped over, or rather jumped over, the convict lying on the floor. He had not expected such a thing from his unwilling guest, but all questions could wait. Without collusion and without wasting any more breath on superfluous words, the young people with the puppy under their armpits flew out of the house and rushed across the plot to the neighbor's cottage. They didn't even turn around to see if they were being followed. They ran up on the porch and banged on the door. Help. Call the police. Help me. Further events merged into several long hours later, recalled as if through a fog. Alarmed neighbors came to help, and soon those who had broken into Alfred's father's cottage in the middle of the night were caught. They were indeed, as Juliana thought at once, escaped prisoners. An ambulance also arrived, and the doctor who examined Alfred said that in principle it was nothing serious. His jaw was not broken, and that was the main thing. Young lady, don't take any more risks like that, the doctor said to Juliana. Alone on such a big man with a frying pan. Dashing, and if you had missed, I can't imagine. And what else could I do? Now that everything was over, Juliana could not stop shivering, although she was drinking a second mug of scalding hot tea and 2 woolen plaids, given by kind, hearted Dacia neighbors, were thrown over her shoulders. Alfred, disobeying Julianne, looked out into the street just as the very convict who had attacked him was being led to the police car. I wish I had time to fight back. Alfred spat on the ground and shook his fist at the man. He cursed and scrambled to his feet, trying to throw himself back into the fight, but of course no one would let him. Alfred heard a few more things about himself and his father. It's all clear, he muttered, walking back into the house and sitting down at the table, leaning over his cup sluggishly. And then he explained to Juliana who it was. It turned out that 2 prisoners had escaped from the very colony where Alfred's father was, and they hadn't chosen his cottage by chance. He had been a lifelong liar, Alfred said. He was both eager to speak and uncomfortable with his own need for candor. Julianne also noticed for the umpteenth time that Alfred called his father he. But in principle, such an oddity was already familiar since the boy's parent had gone to the colony 4 years ago. Alfred almost never said father or Lawrence. He lied here, too. I thought it would add to his influence in the zone. The young man grinned bitterly. He was still at home when he was still lying about the gold buried in the dacha, which he had stolen back in the 90s. You can imagine. Usually Alfred spoke about his father without emotion, but now apparently, against the background of the experience, his intonation oozed indignation. He lied to me that there was gold in the garden, and I was just a little kid back then. So I took a shovel and dug joyfully from fence to fence. Where did I get my strength from? He was laughing. You mean there's no gold? Julianne asked. No, of course not. Everyone here was using metal detectors about 10 years ago. The summer house was rented out to some students. They listened to that nonsense and started to turn everything upside down, looking for it. And there was never any gold. That's it. It's so simple. He couldn't accept the fact that he was no longer the big bandit everyone was afraid of. That he had once lost at cards. Mom left us back then. That's probably why he'd lost his mind. So he created the illusion that he had money, but it wasn't time to take it yet. What a bastard. Alfred raised his voice. Even before he died, he had time to make a mess. How do I know that no one else will come here in El Dorado in the middle of nowhere? I've had enough. I'm leaving. It was none of her business. And if she had had the opportunity to leave and never see Alfred again in her life, but a little earlier, before the attack, she would have gladly taken it and would even have given a lot for such a gift of fate. But now, she couldn't explain it to herself, and she didn't want to get into the intricacies of her feelings. But she just suddenly realized that she cared about Alfred. It was discouraging, frightening, made her feel like a bad, spoiled girl. But Julianne couldn't change that, even if she wanted to. Will you pass your exams? Alfred extended his hand and snapped his fingers in front of her nose. Wake up. What exams? What will this school give me? What about going to college? She whispered. The woolen blanket slipped off her shoulders, but the girl didn't even notice the chill. Yeah, the institute. People like me. Missing. Nothing in life is meant to be. Alfred averted his eyes. No, you're not lost. You don't have to be. There's no such thing as being like your father, or that you have to live your whole life unhappy. You can be different, whatever you want. Julianne's voice sounded firm and determined now, as if she were speaking to a large audience, like her class, and had something very important to tell them. What do you know about me? Alfred said it in his usual mocking and superior tone, but there was a different kind of loneliness and lostness in his eyes, like he was suddenly alone in the world. Julianne knew, in fact, that he was. He could have sworn this guy didn't have any really close friends, the kind you trusted like yourself. The kind you trusted like yourself, the kind who wouldn't let you go to waste. And then the thought struck like lightning. But did she have any? A grandmother is something else. A family person. She replaced mom and dad, but still it's different. And she doesn't have any friends, Julianne herself. You're right, she replied. I know the rumors, and what you yourself have said, and that's not much. And you don't need more than that. Alfred rose abruptly from the table. Let me call you a cab home. No way. Steve, the neighbor and owner of the cottage, intervened in the conversation. He hadn't overheard the conversation. He just had his own business with the late Sprouts in the next room and overheard a lot of things. Steve had known Alfred for 3 years, that is, exactly, since he had bought a plot here. At first he had thought Alfred was a troublemaker and a criminal. That's how the distant relative of the young man, who became his guardian, had described it. But then Steve changed his opinion, if only because no one in the cottage community and in the nearby village could not recall any bad deeds in which Alfred was involved. If only because this kid was seen in good deeds here. He helped to fix the barn for livestock one grandmother in the village. He helped to find a lost cat in some townspeople who came to the cottage for summer vacation. He participated in clearing the pond of all sorts of garbage, and even once restrained the local gang of hooligans when they got to molest the girls' daughters of the owners of the lost cat. All in all, Alfred was, in Steve's opinion, a great guy. He didn't really understand what he had in common with Juliana, and decided that it was probably his girlfriend. A romantic interest, so to speak. Why don't you come and sleep at our place? There's plenty of room. I'll give you some bedding. We'll set up 2 places right away, youngsters. We'll have tea in the morning. Steve waved his hand. And then I'll give you both a lift to the station. All right? Julianne and Alfred nodded in agreement. So they all did. Grushenka, at last you're back. A neighbor who looked out of the apartment across the hall rushed to the girl. Good afternoon, Selina. The girl smiled politely. I slept over at an acquaintance's place. She had already prepared a lie about the fact that this acquaintance had a small child, and she needed to work the night shift, and her husband too, and so, until they adjust the schedules as necessary, they are looking for friends who will sit with the baby. But from the next words of the neighbor, Juliana almost fainted. I got a call. I know your grandmother well, Selina said quickly. They called from the hospital. They couldn't reach you. Oh, what a grief. And she was in good health. What? What's wrong with Grandma? Julianne leaned against the cold entryway wall. I was called, so the neighbor was in no hurry to get to the point. Anyway, during the night, Leslie got worse. The doctors were frantic. Oh, what a grief. You're all alone, the neighbor longed. Grandmother. Is she dead? Julianne's hand rose and lay on her neck. How hard it is to breathe. It felt like the sky was going to fall on my head. Was it really like this? Like this ridiculous everything? She was far away from her grandmother in her last hour. No. Why would you think that? Of spit. The neighbor waved her hands. Don't you listen to me at all? What am I telling you, stupid? I'm telling you that you are alone since Grandma went to the hospital. I'm telling you that you are alone. Anyway, by morning she was feeling better, and they called me again to say that they had never seen a patient recover so soon. They say that in such a manner, in a week, she'll be home. Oh, Grushenka, why have you turned so pale? You look as if you were undead. Selina, the girl shook her head and turned away, jingling her keys to open her apartment door. You can't talk at all. That's why they don't like you in the whole building. And she went in and slammed the door, extremely impolite, without even saying goodbye to her neighbor. Selina stood with her mouth hanging open. Julianne had never let herself do anything like this before. However, said the neighbor, and then, remembering that she had put the chicken on the boil for soup and left the fire on high, she yelped and ran back to her room. Her grandmother was indeed soon discharged home, and life in Juliana's small family quickly returned to normal. But then it became clear that something was changing. Juliana often thought about Alfred. They hadn't seen each other since they parted at the station. The boy said he would go on the next train, but for now he wanted to walk a little more and think about everything. Sometimes walking down the street, Julianne caught herself looking for him with her eyes. Why? She couldn't explain it to herself clearly, but she remembered what he had said at the station before the train started. He had said he was very sorry for her and apologized for the idiotic bet. I thought I'd feel better if I got you. It's only made it worse. He didn't explain anything else. He just disappeared. Julianne thought once about finding him herself. Just go to his house. Maybe he hadn't had time to move out of his family's apartment yet. But each time she restrained herself from such pointless foolishness. Then, as the train pulled away from Juliana, Alfred looked at her and then, pulling the puppy gently by the leash, went for a walk. He really had a lot to think about. Time after time he replayed the events of the previous evening. But until the moment when the strangers had broken into the house, when Juliana had yet to arrive, Alfred had been in a state of confusion. In his mind, he knew that he could triumph and get literally anything he wanted from her. But only his own recent impudence somehow began to seem an unworthy, dirty deed. And imagining what would happen when the girl crossed the threshold of the dacha, Alfred somehow could not in his fantasies, to do anything indecent. The most he could imagine was a kiss, and this hesitancy, this stupid modesty, only irritated him more. Then he belatedly still thought about the fact that, as promised then in the library, Can Tomorrow theoretically treat kebabs, pork, and carolonade is in the fridge, but nothing now for evening tea. Delicious. There is no such thing. It turned out quite nonsense. He invited the girl of his dreams, but he could not accept her. The dog pulled the leash sharply, thus pulling Alfred out of his thoughts. No, said the boy. There are geese grazing there. Let's not go hunting them. Let's go in the grass over there, you little dog. It'll be like a jungle for you. Let's play. But even while having fun with his pet, Alfred couldn't stop the flow of thoughts. Only now they took a different direction. He remembered suddenly how many times his father had grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and said that they were of the same breed, and that Alfred was destined to be a thief, a bandit, and that at 6, at 8, at 10, he hated his father like that. He fought him off, shouted that he would never do such abominations as he did. Because of this, his father was furious and threatened that he would teach his son wisdom. And then, growing up, Alfred began to realize that many people were not ready to listen to him about who he was in himself. It turned out that many people perceived him as the son of that thief Lawrence from So. And So's house, Alfred faced the fact that children were forbidden to play with him. He was looked down upon in the local stores as if he were 12 years old and only thinking about stealing something. Mistrust, contempt. Alfred responded to all this at first with muffled resentment, and then came other feelings. Alfred became hostile to the world. He didn't want to be like his father, but he also realized that he was too often seen as a creature in Lawrence's shadow, as an extension of him. Alfred grew up a disobedient child. He realized early on that it was not necessary to ask about his mother. He had enough of one frank conversation with his father, who said that she left him for a new family, in which the husband is also right, and even rich, in which other normal children have already been born. Alfred, it was enough to realize that it turns out that the mother, as if he is an orphan half with a living parent. And then it happened so that Alfred found understanding in the company of guys who were considered the main bullies in the neighborhood. They somehow got together. He was attracted by the fact that these guys do not suspect him of any evil, do not persecute. Yes, they were not the ideal of virtue, real hooligans, but society with them beckoned so that he had no strength to resist. Alfred, however, kept a little to himself, and in many of their scandalous antics did not participate. He was 16 when the leader of the gang said that they didn't need a man who wasn't ready to be on the same page with them. Alfred got sidetracked, except the rumors about what a scumbag he was didn't go away. They grew like weeds, and now he could not and did not want to fight them. In fact, he decided that it was probably even better. They would be more afraid, so they would be less offended. And for a while it seemed that it was normal to exist like that. But now Alfred wasn't so sure. He was sick to think that he had no other way but to follow the stereotypes that surrounded him. It was impossibly strange, but it was since he'd begun to get closer to Julianne that he'd been having those thoughts more often. And after the events of that night, Alfred suddenly realized clearly that he could really make his life anything he wanted it to be. He just had to make up his mind and change everything quickly. Finally, despite the fact that the final exams were approaching and free time was reduced to 0, Julianne found an opportunity to work part-time on Sundays. It was a simple job handing out flyers to passers, by on the street, and paid very little. But it was the very first money earned in the life of a young girl. After calculating the income for 2 weekends, Julianne made a difficult decision. How scary it was. But it was too late to retreat. It seemed to her that forward to the fulfillment of her plans, she was drawn by some unknown force, which is simply impossible to resist. First, Juliana went to the confectionery and chose a cake very small, half a kilo. But as assured her saleswoman at home, delicious, it was honey cake with a layer of black currants. And then she walked into the mall, into a familiar clothing store. Julianne's heart raced as she stopped at the racks, above which plastic letters that folded into the word discounts hung invitingly. "Can I get you anything?" Julianne shuddered as the young woman approached her. It was the same slightly familiar Caroline. For the first time in her life, Julianne felt so keenly that she looked wonderful in the old-fashioned chintz dress below the knee, and she felt like a scarecrow. "I'd like to try this on," she said, and pulled the shoulders of the dress. It was a smoky gray knee, high dress made of knitted fabric with a couple of pockets in the front. Juliana chose it because it cost 499 rubles, and she had exactly 500 left after buying the cake. The consultant looked at the dress that the unusual client was wearing, then at the dress on the shoulder pads. "I'm sorry, but may I offer some advice?" She smiled shyly. "These are leftovers from the last collection." And here, stepping back a step, she pointed to 4 mannequins showing brightly colored sundresses made of cotton with floral prints. "A new collection, but we just haven't had time to put these particular models on sale yet. If you want, I will now bring your size," the consultant gabbled amiably. "One moment, please." Before Julianne could say that she shouldn't worry, the consultant disappeared and then reappeared, carrying 4 sundresses of different colors and in 2 sizes each. And right now, Juliana just didn't have the strength to refuse. Once these marvelous outfits were in her hands, It was as if a witch's spell had fallen on her. In the end, she came out of the fitting room, clutching a sundress with large fuchsia flowers to her chest. "It's a great choice." "It suits you very well," continued Caroline, who immediately escorted the happy-looking customer to the checkout, and there, having sent her partner to the back of the hall to fix her clothes, which had been tumbled around all day, she herself began to calculate the price. "Thank you for helping me choose." Julianne smiled. Her cheeks burned with a feverish blush. "Thank you, Caroline. Always happy to help update the image," smiled the one in return. Julianne didn't know that Caroline had already looked at her before approaching her, and realized from the fact that she had counted the bills several times that the budget for the outfit was very small. Juliana didn't know that the sundress she had chosen actually cost $2,500 with all the discounts. "So you owe exactly $500, the counselor said with a nonchalant look. Julianne was already holding out the money, but her eyes fell on the cash register display, where the real price was displayed, and Caroline had hoped the girl wouldn't notice it. "But," Julianne stammered and looked incomprehensible. "That's the old price. The system malfunctioned." Caroline quickly found it, and seeing that the girl was procrastinating, Caroline herself took the bill from her hands and also slid a rustling bag of clothes toward her across the counter. "Take it, please, and thank you for buying." They exchanged glances, and it was so quick, so piercing, so clear. Julianne clutched the package to her as if she couldn't believe in its tangible reality. "Thank you," and she walked out of the store. Before the girl, who was acting as a cashier in the store that day, returned to her seat, Caroline had managed to take out of her pocket a purse that she simply did not risk to leave in the changing room of the shopping center for the staff, and put into the cash register the missing $2,000 for the sold sundress. If in those moments there was someone who would have asked her about the reason for such an act, she would not have been able to clearly answer what moved her, but certainly not ordinary pity. It was just, she decided that it was the right thing to do. It was not the first time Caroline had seen Julianne in the store or in the city. They lived on the same street, and even their houses were close window to window. Caroline was not a gossip, but if you did not live a reclusive life, you would learn about many of your neighbors, and especially about those about whom people said that they were strange. This is how Caroline came to know Grandma Leslie and her child from afar, through hearsay. Caroline herself had been raised in a single-parent family by her grandparents. True, not because of orphanhood, just parents were constantly on business trips, then in tourist trips in general, lived their own, some separate from the native child, a rich life. But Caroline's grandparents were quite modern people, and so for her, Juliana's upbringing seemed wild, but there was nothing to be done. Caroline had long been married for 10 years. It was quite a happy union, and in principle, her husband's income would allow her to exist as a housewife. But when her son Victor went to the first grade, Caroline decided that enough of her reclusiveness and got a job in the shopping center, especially since she had always wanted the job to have something to do with clothes. Perhaps Caroline sometimes thought it was somehow passed on from her grandmother, who had worked as a dressmaker for almost 40 years. It was here in the clothing store when Caroline had a chance to get to know Julianne and her grandmother better, and the visits of an old woman and a teenage girl who then turned into a young and beautiful girl. The whole store, as they say, was painful to watch, because Leslie, in her characteristic manner, was always reprimanding her granddaughter. "Don't touch it, you'll tear it. No, you're not wearing that shit. No way. It's not for you. Put it back. Don't cry. I spend the money. I decide what you wear." These were the phrases that accompanied their trips to the store for a down jacket, demi-jacket, and other outerwear. A miserable child, another saleswoman once expressed a similar opinion to Carolina's. What will she grow up to be with a grandmother like that? Caroline shook her head. She didn't know what to say, and she felt guilty for some reason. It seemed that it was impossible to watch her grandmother raising her granddaughter indifferently all these years, keeping her swaddled in a cocoon of strange, frightening, giving off a slight madness of care. It's why Caroline had done that with the Sundress, who suddenly realized that it seemed that something special had happened in Juliana's life. Something immeasurably important that moved her to finally break that cocoon. "Grandma," Julianne said, "let's have some tea." When she returned home, the girl hastily stashed her new clothes in her room and went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on, put out the tea pairs from the special ceremonial set, which, according to the established rules, appeared on the table only on holidays, and on the calendar, a magnetic bright square marked the most ordinary Sunday. "What's this?" the old woman frowned. "When did you bake this?" "I didn't bake, Grandma." Julianne smiled and pushed her chair over. Grandma, don't be angry, okay? I decided not to go for a walk this weekend, not to the theater, not to go to exhibitions. Not to the theater, not to go to exhibitions, not to the library, but to work a little." And Julianne told her mentor about what she had been doing. "I just decided that I'm graduating soon and I need to. At least some experience how to work to get..." Leslie sat down at the table. She looked incredulously at the piece of cake her granddaughter had dropped on her plate. "Grandma, it's all natural. And it's fresh. But how much did you make?" 1,000, Julianne replied. "How much is the cake?" 500. "Where is the rest of the money?" Julianne swallowed hard. "The school asked me to take a job as a prom photographer." She blurted out the first thing that came to mind. And when Granny raised faded blue eyes, squinted intently, Julianne had no doubt in those moments she would be exposed. "Now," but here Leslie nodded. "It used to be customary to ask your elders what to do. Well, come on, what can I take from you, you foolish girl? And after school, no job. You'll go to school, no job. You'll go to school." The old woman finally broke off a piece of cake with a dessert spoon. She brought it to her mouth. Granddaughter held her breath. "That'll do," Leslie said, and didn't say another word during the tea. Then she asked to have her blood pressure taken and lay down on the sofa in front of the TV to watch a documentary about Weden. The girl was happy that the cake was favorably received. Her grandmother was amazingly nice. The last time Julianne had bought cake to the hospital, she had thrown it out the window, shouting that she would not poison herself with palm oil. Maybe today's tea party is a sign of good things to come. Julianne smiled as she finished the dishes, but then she remembered Alfred again. It seemed like an eternity since that unimaginable incident at the cottage. And in all that time, she hadn't seen Alfred. It was as if he had disappeared from her life altogether, vanished into thin air. The only thing she knew was that he had dropped out of school after all. However, this surprised few people there, and the head teacher, not hesitating in expressions, prophesied this bully the most terrible end like his father. Julianne did not agree with her, and almost spoke out loud, but she held back. It wouldn't have made any difference. Who would believe her that Alfred wasn't really as horrible a person as everyone thought he was? Julianne had passed her final exams, and finally the big day of graduation had arrived. The grandmother knew in advance that her granddaughter would wear a dark blue velvet dress, which Juliana's mother once wore to the school graduation. That dress, under a black silk sash, was now hanging on its hangers on the closet door. But yesterday's schoolgirl, going to the main holiday, was now dressing up in front of the mirror, admiring herself in a very different outfit. A sundress with marvelous, juicy pink flowers. For the first time, Juliana didn't put her hair in a braid, but instead, having washed it in the evening, twisted it into curls. She didn't have a blowtorch at home, of course, but she used an old folk trick and got the curls with the help of ordinary socks. "Granddaughter, what took you so long, huh? You'll be late." Julianne flinched when she heard her grandmother. But the smile didn't disappear from her face. She felt more confident than ever. After another glance at herself in the mirror, She walked resolutely to the door. Leslie staggered backwards, and if she hadn't taken her heart pills that morning, she might have had a second heart attack. Because the granddaughter, what a sight she appeared, as if Grushenka wasn't even her own. "Grandma, I love you very much." The girl intercepted the old woman's hands, gently squeezed the wrinkled hands with her cold fingers. "But in that dress, my mother's dress, I won't go. I bought it for my paycheck. I can't live like this anymore, Grandma. It's not right." And so they stood opposite each other, the old generation and the young, the people most dear to each other, the closest people who sometimes could almost read each other's mind, and at the same time very different, belonging to different worlds. But then Leslie as if died. Her lips and chin trembled, her eyes darkened. She took her hands away and sighed deeply, full-breasted, exhaled through her teeth. Julianne put her hands behind her back and lowered her eyes. "I won't be long, Grandma. I'll just get my diploma, take a picture with the kids in the park, and go home." "Grandma," she took a timid step toward the door. "I'll go, okay?" "Oh," said Leslie, suddenly calm. "And don't be in a hurry. It's such a young thing." "Stop." She stopped. She stopped when the girl opened the door to the landing. Leslie opened the soap box. It was an old ceramic box with roses on the lid. The soap that had been in it almost 100 years ago smelled of roses, too. Now it held cash, which was usually used to go to the store for groceries, to pay the light bill, and so on. Determinedly, the old woman shoveled out all the content of the box, about 3,000, and handed it to her granddaughter. "Here, I remember we didn't give it up for graduation, so give it to whoever needs it. It's not out of favor that they're feeding you. Grandma, go already." The old woman interrupted her and waved her arms as if she were chasing away a butterfly that had accidentally flown into the house. "Or you'll be late." Julianne left. Leslie returned to the hall and sank down in her favorite chair, her hands on the armrests, and closed her eyes. The clock ticked quietly. Tears rolled down from under the old woman's closed eyelids. But it was a light sadness just somehow came to suddenly realize that everything the granddaughter grew up, though I tried to keep her from foolishness, temptations, vices of this world. But apparently people are right. It is impossible to hide it from the youth. And then Leslie dozed off. Her classmates who saw Juliana in her new clothes, but most importantly in an unusual form, did not immediately recognize who was in front of them. For a while, the merry murmur subsided, and all eyes were fixed on the newcomer. Some of the guys whistled, and many girls looked enviously. It turned out that the odd girl had a gorgeous figure, and her hair, usually hidden in tight braids, was now curling in lush, silky curls. Julianne, Headmaster Barry, approached the girl. "You're great. He spread his hands. "I wouldn't be lying if I said I've never seen a more beautiful senior in my life." Much later, looking back on this day, Juliana understood that its bright events merged in the end into one long action, like multicolored glasses of a kaleidoscope are put together in one pattern. But this applied to the day exactly until the moment when, after a walk in the park, sitting in a cafe and general photographing, she was suddenly called by a familiar voice. The sun was already setting. Its fiery golden rays penetrated the green of the trees and still blinded her, so Juliana squinted her eyes, and the silhouette of the guy standing nearby turned out to be quite blurred. "Alfred," she said in disbelief. The other seniors didn't even notice her slipping away, their first impressions having dissipated, and they were more interested in each other's company, leaving the strange-looking roommate to her own devices. As in previous years, Alfred stood at the entrance to the park. Alfred was standing at the entrance to the park, again in tattered jeans, but his jacket was a new brownish-red one that fit. "Congratulations," he said and smiled. "You dropped out of school after all," she said reproachfully. But that wasn't what she'd meant to say when she was almost running toward him. "I've been busy, selling the apartment and the cottage." He glanced down and back, smirking. "And you're a pretty girl, it turns out. Okay, I won't distract you." I nodded at the group of school children in the distance. "I'm not with them," Julianne replied. "I guess I don't fit in with society after all." "You don't need that," Alfred said. "You'll find other people you'll be comfortable with." It was a strange word and phrase for him in general. Julianne squinted her eyes. "So you decided to leave after all. I need to find my place somewhere." Okay, he was obviously going to say something else, but he stifled himself and took a step back. "Have a nice day." Julianne didn't have time to say what she wanted to say. That they needed to talk, that he wasn't all alone. That she had to understand, she had to find out how to help him, but all these thoughts were swarming in her mind. She couldn't put it all out coherently right now. She could only stare at him. How she needed him to take a tiny step toward her, just the tiniest bit. But he sent her a freezing stare instead. His face contorted hard, and he turned and simply ran. And at the same time it seemed that he was not just rushing to the bus. He was running away from her and from the conversation that could take place between them. The figures of swans surrounded by live snow, white hyacinths with flecks of candy, pink eustoma, were beautiful. And if the organizer of this wedding celebration was asked to name the most successful element of the banquet hall decoration, she would have pointed to these ice sculptures, rhythmically tapping a mini pen on the page of the notebook, the entries in which were so small and abbreviated that only their creator could decipher it. The girl looked at her creation. Splendid. Thanks to this order, she would finally close the mortgage for the apartment, and after it, perhaps, she could treat herself to a vacation which she hadn't been on for the past 2 years. With a satisfied sigh and a nod to her own thoughts, Julianne returned the writing utensils to the pocket of the immaculately tailored smoky gray jacket that went with the pencil skirt and silk blouse in a soft lavender shade. Stylish, but not overly dressy, because she, after all, is a responsible person here and in no way should not compete with the bride or even the guests. "Guys, this way," came a voice from behind us as the doors opened. Julianne rounded her eyes as some workers with a stepladder and some other guy in a black suit entered the room. "Over there," the guy stretched out, pointing his hand at the wall. More precisely, on that part of it, which was located behind the seats for the young and was generously draped with silk and brocade, the folds of which were supported by golden figures of cupids. "Hey, what are you doing?" The girl stomped indignantly toward the intruders. "Don't you dare touch anything." The worker stopped and turned to the supervisors and the supervisors to her. Security, the tall brunette threw, and stuck his thumbs behind the belt of his pants and smirked. That came out extremely cheeky. "We are working. Please do not interfere. Stay out of it." Julianne burst out indignantly. "Do you know how long we've been laying this up? What do you think you're doing here? Why didn't I do anything?" And then she stopped talking because the young man's face seemed familiar. Alfred? Apparently, mutual recognition came to them synchronously. "Julianne," he said, "what are you doing here?" "A wedding," she replied simply, quite matter-of-factly. "What are you doing here?" "Working too," he replied. "So what should we do?" one of the workers asked. "Wait a minute." Alfred waved him away and focused his attention back on the young woman in front of him. He remembered her. All those years he'd been picking up the pieces of his life. And she remembered him, too often than she would have liked. Much more often than she should have remembered a guy she knew from school, not even a classmate, whose close acquaintance had taken place under not the most romantic circumstances. But that was the past. And now they exchanged a few more phrases. And it turned out that Alfred is the head of security of the father of the bride Bruce, a complicated man, a businessman, and even an oligarch. Alfred had spent almost all these years in other lands, and then, having built up a solid reputation in the security field, decided to return to the city, which he still considered the most native place. And it was here that he eventually found his best job. "I never would have guessed," Julianne said frankly when Alfred informed her what he was doing. "Of course. With my pedigree and track record," he replied, and it was not clear whether he was really offended or was being kindly ironic about himself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Julianne was immediately taken aback. It was normal, so familiar, as if all those years apart hadn't happened. Alfred grinned. "And you create all this?" He circled the surrounding space with his hand. "Cute, but of course terribly girlish, if you know what I mean." "Not at all." Julianne was always very sensitive, on the verge of being painful, to criticism of her creations. She could speak calmly about anything and everything, only directly to her clients. But the rest of us would be better to hold our tongues. Julianne herself often regretted her temper, but found the reason for it. Apparently, it was hereditary, from her grandmother's temper. The decoration is created taking into account the tastes and wishes of the bride and groom. Our agency is focused on the current global trends in wedding fashion," said the girl. "Wait a minute," bowed Alfred's head. "Ours? Are you married and doing business with your husband? Do you think that's the only way to do it?" Julianne frowned again. No, just like that, he thought, scratching at the back of his head with a familiar gesture. "I'm not married." "Wonderful. What do you mean?" "Oh, never mind. So you started an agency with someone and you do weddings?" "Mostly them. But we also do wedding anniversaries. Engagement parties." "Do you celebrate divorces?" "No." Julianne had fallen into such a strange state of mind from the conversation with Alfred that she even missed the trill of her work phone. The girl carried 2 miniature smartphones, the second one containing only personal contacts. And before such neglect of her professional duties was not peculiar to her. Who would ever think of celebrating a divorce? "I don't know," he shrugged. "I was celebrating. I went to the sea for 2 weeks, just lying on the sand and matured. To go on, well, to live. And I asked about you. Well, I thought that if you like weddings so much, you should probably be married already. Maybe even more than once." "Why is that?" To the first impressions of delight, surprise, and even heart palpitations, a familiar irritation began to set in. "It's just déjà vu. So it is a wedding. How many different weddings can be played?" Having the opportunity and imagination, Alfred spoke absolutely serious tone, but his eyes laughed. "I'm not married, I haven't been yet," Julianne replied, nervously fixing her already perfect hair, which was now a bob. "So what do you need to do here? The cameras have lost the image of the auditorium. You must have covered it up with your fancy trinkets. So put the camera somewhere else. It's got the perfect viewing angle. It's not my problem. The design has already been thought out, and it is impossible to change it. Who cares where the bows are? This is about safety." "What? Are you afraid the bride will be stolen?" "Don't worry. It's not in the script." "I don't know." Alfred was suddenly close. Just dangerously close, literally hovering over her with his whole weight. Julianne thought, inappropriately, that he'd gotten noticeably bigger or broader in the shoulders. "It's been 10 years, Alfred said. You haven't changed at all." But very much so, the girl felt awkward. And for some reason she was sure that the traitorous blush was well visible, despite the foundation, blush, and powder. So what to do? Couldn't stand it. One of the workers, who had a bunch of other things planned for the day. Julianne and Alfred backed away, just bounced away from each other like a flock of birds scattering. And soon, with Julianne's instruction, the textile decor was moved so that it would not block the cut of the cameras. "Well, now everything is ready," the girl said smugly, and Alfred visibly revived. "So, can we talk?" Julianne wanted to say that she was terribly busy, but that wouldn't be true. And besides, she wanted to talk to the man who had made her heart beat so strangely often all these years. They were still a few hours before the wedding reception at the bride's father's mansion, and Alfred and Julianne had agreed to sit on the back porch for a while. It was the quietest place right now. They sat down directly on the steps. In front of them, stretched out as if wild, but in fact skillfully cultivated garden in the English style. Juliana told about how after 2 courses at the university to study philology, she realized that it was absolutely not her business and dropped out, deciding to take a big risk just to make a living for a while, as it turns out, and in parallel to look for themselves. In the end, it turned out that she liked to create holidays, and 5 years ago, she and Caroline created a small agency, which by now has become one of the leading in the city. Caroline, Alfred was surprised. The one whose husband is an electrician. They also have Victor's son. I remember her. She always treated me differently, he added, and averted his eyes. Not like the others. I know, Julianne nodded. She and I were talking about you the other day, and she told me all about it. That you weren't a monster at all. And when again did you think I was a monster? He squinted his eyes as if with resentment. When you invited me to the cottage. I swear Julia smiled. It was the most nightmarish date of my life, and mine. I'd give anything to have it any other way. And anyway, what an idiot I was. I should have just asked her out in a normal way, to a movie, for example. I shouldn't have been afraid that you'd say no. Understandably, the girl nervously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The conversation somehow suddenly turned into a direction that was not the most convenient for free conversation. How's Grandma? Asked Alfred. She's fine. I'm amazed at her age, and she's still going strong. Her health, of course, sometimes fails her. But in terms of fortitude, she's enough for 10 people. You know, I've only recently been able to understand her. It seemed to me then, when I had just finished school, that I had escaped from a nightmare. And then I was able to realize that she just loved me very much and thought to protect me that way. I talked to the doctor. My grandmother is seeing a psychologist, Julianne explained, and she agreed to go to him to find out why she was having bad dreams. And then he got her talking. And then he got her talking. And then, it's easier for us to live together. Anyway, the psychologist doesn't want to scare her, but he said it's like she had an obsession. Good thing she stopped in time, you know. Sometimes I feel so guilty for leaving Grandma alone for so long. But I got her a nurse. She's a very decent woman. She takes good care of her. And now she doesn't need anything. The girl smoothed her skirt on her knees, looked at Alfred carefully, catching his gaze. How long have you been divorced? Last year. I told you we didn't see eye to eye. I guess I'm just not a good person. Somehow I thought you'd changed since then. And not for the worse. So I don't think you're a bad person. Alfred, what about your mother? She said carefully. Do you know what's wrong with her? I mean, have you ever thought about... I found her, Alfred answered, and it seemed that he was ready to answer frankly to this question, but only wanted to get off as soon as possible. We talked, calmly, peacefully. She apologized and told me not to come back. She really has a whole other life. There's no place for me there, but I forgave her. That's it. Julianne was silent. They just sat side by side and watched the wind move the tall, lush grasses and the flowers among them. I'd forgotten, Julianne exclaimed. Master, 10 years is a long time for a dog, but he's fine. Alfred grinned. He lives here with me. He's in the enclosure now. Do you want to say hello? He stood up and offered his hand to the girl. I do. She rose, accepting the outstretched palm. Alfred rounded his eyes. He hadn't expected this at all. Conditions? The master will recognize me immediately. And then you'll give me a personal tour of the place. Tell me what the security service does. I only know from movies you walk around and talk to someone on the radio all the time, right? Almost, Alfred replied. And if you lose, then you can take a chance and ask me out. The young man grinned. It was a very tempting offer. And whatever the outcome of the bet, he somehow had no doubt that the date would happen, and it would be very easy to turn the excursion into one. And Alfred also thought that perhaps now he had to become a really good guy. It was necessary to become a good husband for Julianne. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.